on January 16, 2009, America lost one of its most quietly powerful painters, Andrew Wyeth. Born into an artistic family, Wyeth built a decades-long career known for meticulous realism, intimate watercolors, and tempera studies that captured light, texture, and the lives of ordinary people. Wyeth's work did more than win acclaim. It put Maine's coast and countryside on the cultural map. His portraits of Maine and life here preserved a vanishing rural world, drew visitors to places like the Olson House and the Farnsworth Museum, and inspired generations of artists to see the drama in everyday New England landscapes. Until tomorrow, I'm Brian Sullivan.